Okay, thanks, Sid. Our next speaker is Dr. James Ping. Okay, it's not advancing. I'll just introduce him. Is an NHMRC Emerging Leadership Fellow at the School of Psychological Sciences, employing a multidisciplinary approach that combines biophysical models, neuroimaging, and connectivity to better understand the mechanisms of brain function and health, disease, and across species. Like frozen. Can someone? Oh, really? Where? Oh, my God.
All right, I'll just do the mouse. All right, I don't want to see myself. Anyway, all right, thanks Maya for organizing this, and maybe you're wondering why am I talking about animals and species in the Human Brain Mapping Conference. Now, hopefully I can just provide you a little bit of a context on why looking at different species is important. All right, let's start with the problem, right? The problem is a challenge of some kind of generalization. As we've heard from Katie and Sid, there's this multi-scale characteristics of the brain that are captured by multimodal data. So we have to kind of make sure that, because the brain is this highly complex entity, but we know that as part of, we belong in one nature, and we must be governed by some underlying biological principles. So there must be a way to connect these scales in different facets. And nature really favors these really simple, elegant, generalized rules. And we know several examples of that. So it must be true for the brain as well. So in my perspective, studying one species alone may only provide you an incomplete, kind of limited picture of that understanding of the brain. So how do we find these universal principles? We can lean towards animals. Right? Again, the brain is a product of evolution. You know, our brain has developed, evolutionarily speaking, to maintain some kind of core design, which is essential, and also developed according to adaptations to our environment. And this is true for every single animal. So we can kind of lean towards those, say, looking at the conserved organization to find these fundamental principles that have survived some kind of evolutionary drift. So that, for example, that example here on the tree is like a tree of multiple mammals, but all of them actually have kind of core principles of sensory motor regions, and we know that those regions are fundamentally important for any species. All right, how do we do this though? Over the last several decades, especially in the macro scale level, I think we've been very, very smart now in developing new ways to compare species. We now have advanced imaging techniques, structurally, functionally, diffusion-wise, so you can now compare tracks between animals and so on and so forth. So we don't really need to rely now on, the track tracing is really important, but we can now kind of use similar imaging modalities to compare these species. We've also been fortunate that people have been developing atlases for example, high resolution spatial transcriptomics, or even in vivo cortical myelination. And we also have advanced computational tools now that you can map brains of one species to the other. So you can now really tease apart evolutionary principles that have been conserved. And some of my favorite examples over the last several decades of how people have used these kinds of combining modalities across species and across scales is, say, looking at areas in the brain that have significantly expanded, because we're always wanting to find, is there a seat of cognition in the human brain? I don't think there is, but people have been finding, say, expansions of the frontal cortex. But another way is, like, say, looking at fMRI. You can now do fMRI in humans, mice, monkeys, and any kind of species that you can think of. And people have now been finding this DMN-like organization in other species, which we originally thought is like very human-specific. So what do these actually mean? Or we can now look at scaling laws of can properties of connectivity just be explained of just because we've just grown significantly bigger? Or do we have deviations away from these fundamental scaling laws. And I think one of my favorite works from this work from Martijn van den Heuvel in the Netherlands, where they've compared the diffusion MRI tracks of humans and chimpanzees, and they found that tracks that are very specific to humans are correlated to disconnectivity in schizophrenia. It's not saying that those tracks are responsible, but they provide clues, I suppose, to some kind of mechanisms of pathology. So in summary, I just want to show, hopefully I've kind of convinced you that universal principles are important in neuroscience, especially in our field, because they enable robust and translatable neuroscience. And more importantly, a multi-species approach enables kind of inference. Because if we study the human brain, the only thing we can learn about is the human brain. But we have to contextualize that if what we're seeing is actually true and conserved across evolution. And there's heaps of new data and modeling approaches that they can make these types of analyses much more easier and powerful. So, thanks. Oh, yeah, I forgot. Anyway, just want to thank Maya for really organizing this. And if this work is something that you are really interested in, we're looking for PhD students to go to this front of work. Thanks.